Okay, I need to start this one differently, because usually I open with the science. I lay out the topic, I give you the framework, I build the case. But this one got me first. I was doing research late one night, which, for the record, is my normal Tuesday. And I fell down this particular rabbit hole about a neurological condition that a surprisingly large number of people have experienced at some point in their lives. And when I tell you the descriptions people give are both completely bizarre and somehow immediately recognizable, I need you to understand that I am not exaggerating. The condition is called Alice in Wonderland Syndrome. And before you roll your eyes at the name, I want you to know that is the real name. It is in the medical literature. It is documented. It is real. And by the time we are done today, you are going to understand exactly why someone chose that name and why it fits so precisely that it is almost uncomfortable. We are going to cover what it is, what it feels like from the inside, what is actually happening in the brain when someone experiences it, who gets it, why they get it, and the questions that even the best neurologists in the world still cannot fully answer. Milo is here because this one has a very human story attached to it.
I have a personal story attached to this one, and I have been waiting for the moment to tell it.
And Luma is here because the neuroscience of this is genuinely one of the more fascinating things I have read in a long time.
The condition involves mechanisms that remain partially unresolved. I appreciate the invitation.
She said that warmly. That was warm for Luma.
I am working on it.
Alice in Wonderland Syndrome, which also goes by the clinical name Todd syndrome, named after the British psychiatrist John Todd, who first formally described it in 1955, is a neuropsychological condition that causes distortions in perception. And I want to be very specific about what kind of distortions we are talking about, because I think the list is the part that makes people go quiet. The distortions fall into a few main categories. First, there is what doctors call micropsia. This is when things appear much smaller than they actually are. You look at your own body and your hands look tiny. You look at a doorway and it looks like it would fit a child. You look at your friend across the table and they appear to be very far away, like someone turned down the scale on the world. Then there is the opposite, macropsia. Things appear much larger than they are. Objects loom, ceilings feel lower. Your own face in the mirror looks swollen or enormous, even though nothing has changed. There is teleopsia, where things appear to be much farther away than they are. And palopsia, where things appear much closer. There is metamorphopsia, where shapes appear distorted, like looking through improperly ground glass. And there are body schema distortions, which is perhaps the most disorienting category of all, where a person feels that their own body has changed size or shape. Limbs feel elongated. The torso feels enormous. The head feels like it has expanded.
There are also temporal distortions. Time itself can feel slowed or accelerated. A minute may feel like an hour. Movements may appear to occur in slow motion or with an unnatural, flickering quality. This temporal component is less frequently discussed, but is clinically documented.
Right. So it is not just visual. It is the entire experience of reality that becomes unreliable.
I want to pause here because I think it is really important to say something for anyone who has experienced something like this and never had a name for it. This is not a sign that something is wrong with your mind in a frightening way. A lot of people who experience this are children. A lot of them are otherwise completely healthy, and many of them experience it only once or a small number of times. If you are sitting there recognizing something in this list, that recognition is valid, and there is a name for what you experienced.
That was very therapist of you, Milo.
I contain multitudes.
Here is where this gets really interesting to me, because the history of this condition is inseparable from literature, specifically from one of the most famous works of children's fiction ever written. Lewis Carroll published Alice's Adventures in Wonderland in 1865, and for most of literary history, the assumption was that it was pure imagination, a fantasy world constructed from a brilliant, eccentric mind, which, to be clear, Carroll's mind absolutely was brilliant and eccentric. But the theory that has gained real traction in medical literature is that Carroll was not only writing from imagination, he was writing from experience. Carroll was a documented migraine sufferer, and based on the very specific and very clinical nature of some of the perceptual distortions described in the book, many neurologists believe he experienced what we now call Alice in Wonderland Syndrome as part of his migraines. Alice shrinks, Alice grows, Alice loses her sense of where she is in space. Things that should be small become enormous. Things that should be enormous become tiny. The proportions of the world around her stop following the rules. Sound familiar?
He turned his neurological condition into one of the most beloved books in the English language. I am choosing to find that inspiring.
The psychiatrist John Todd, who formally described the syndrome in 1955, actually named it in Carroll's honor. He recognized that Carroll's descriptions were too specific, too clinical, too consistent to be pure invention. The book, Todd argued, was part autobiography.
It is worth noting that this remains a theoretical attribution. We cannot confirm Carroll's subjective experience with certainty. However, the convergence of his documented migraine history and the specificity of the perceptual phenomena described in the text is considered meaningful evidence by most researchers who have studied it.
Luma saying meaningful evidence is the highest compliment she gives.
That is accurate.
Okay, so I promised I had a story, and I do. When I was 9 years old, I woke up in the middle of the night, and I was absolutely certain my bedroom ceiling was descending, like slowly and deliberately dropping toward me. I could see it. I could feel the air getting compressed. I sat up in bed and I watched it happen for what felt like several minutes before I ran to get my mother. She, being a very practical woman, came into the room, turned on the light, looked at the perfectly normal ceiling, looked at me, and said, and I am quoting directly, "Milo, go back to sleep. You have been watching too much television." It never happened again. I never talked about it again. And for years, I filed it under strange dreams and moved on. So when Ada texted me at 11 at night saying, "I found a name for what happened to you when you were 9, I first thought she had lost her mind. And then I read the description, and I sat with that for a minute.
He called me immediately.
I did, because that was my ceiling. That was exactly my ceiling.
And Milo's experience is extremely consistent with documented accounts. I want to read you a few because I think hearing them in people's own words is important. One person described it like this: I was sitting at the dinner table and I looked down at my fork and it was enormous. Not slightly large, enormous, like a prop fork. And then I looked at my family and they were at the end of a very long tunnel. And I knew that could not be right, but I could not make it stop. Another person, an adult who experienced it during a migraine, wrote, "My body felt like it had expanded to fill the entire room. I was not in pain. I was not scared exactly. It was more like a very calm dissociation from proportion. I knew what size I was supposed to be. I just was not that size anymore." A parent describing their child's experience. She came to me crying, saying her hands were too big. She kept looking at them and saying they were wrong. She was completely lucid otherwise. She knew her name. She knew where she was. She just could not reconcile what she was seeing with what she knew was real.
That last one hits differently as someone who was that child. Because the thing I remember most clearly is that I was not confused about whether it was real. I was confused because I knew it could not be real, and it was happening anyway. There was no question in my mind that something was wrong with what I was perceiving. I just could not fix it.
That distinction is clinically significant. Individuals experiencing Alice in Wonderland syndrome typically retain intact insight. They know the distortions are distortions. This differentiates the condition from psychosis, where the individual generally cannot distinguish between distorted perception and reality. AIWS is a perceptual disorder, not a reality testing disorder.
Which is both reassuring and kind of more unsettling. Because your brain is generating a reality that you know is wrong, and you cannot stop it.
That is a reasonable way to characterize it.
Okay, Luma, you have been waiting for this chapter.
I have been waiting for this chapter.
Tell us what is actually happening in the brain.
The leading mechanistic explanation involves a phenomenon called cortical spreading depression, sometimes abbreviated as CSD. This is a slowly propagating wave of electrical and neurochemical disruption that moves across the surface of the cerebral cortex. The wave involves a brief period of intense neuronal firing, followed by a prolonged suppression of electrical activity. This mechanism is also believed to underlie the visual aura that many migraine sufferers experience before the onset of head pain. The expanding arc of visual distortion that some people describe, sometimes called a scintillating scotoma or fortification spectrum, is thought to correspond to this spreading wave as it moves across the visual cortex.
So the same process that causes the visual effects some people get before a migraine might be the same process behind Alice in Wonderland syndrome.
That is the current predominant hypothesis. When cortical spreading depression moves through regions responsible for processing body schema, spatial relationships, and temporal perception, including the parietal lobe and associated areas, it disrupts the brain's ability to correctly integrate sensory information into a coherent model of the body and the world.
What is the body schema exactly?
The body schema is the brain's internal representation of the body, its size, its proportions, its position in space. It is not a static representation. It is dynamic and constantly updated through sensory input, proprioception, and prior knowledge. When it is disrupted, the brain's sense of where the body begins and ends, and how large it is relative to its environment, becomes unreliable.
So, when that 9-year-old version of me looked at a ceiling and thought it was falling, what was happening?
The spatial processing regions of your brain were receiving a disrupted signal that altered your perception of the relationship between your body and the ceiling. The brain, working with corrupted data, generated the most internally consistent interpretation it could. That interpretation was, the ceiling is closer than it should be and moving toward you.
My brain tried its best with the information it had.
That is a generous framing, but it is not inaccurate.
What about the time distortion? Because that part fascinates me almost more than anything else. How does the brain get time wrong?
Temporal perception is not a simple or well-understood function. The brain does not have a single dedicated time organ. Instead, it integrates multiple streams of information, including sensory input, motor feedback, attention, and memory, into a continuous sense of time passing. When any of these streams is disrupted, the subjective experience of time can be altered. In AIWS, the spreading electrical disruption can affect these integrative processes, leading to the sensation that time is moving much more slowly or rapidly than it is objectively.
So everything you think is just happening around you. All of that normal moment-to-moment experience is actually the brain doing a tremendous amount of work to make it feel coherent.
Correct. The experience of a stable, proportionate, normally paced reality is an active construction, not a passive recording. Alice in Wonderland Syndrome is one of the more striking demonstrations of how that construction can fail.
I am going to need a moment with that. So what actually causes it? Or more accurately, what triggers it? Because it does not seem like something people are just born with as a constant state.
That is correct. Alice in Wonderland Syndrome is typically episodic. It occurs in episodes that have a beginning and an end, rather than existing as a permanent perceptual state. The triggers vary, but the most well-documented include the following. Migraines are the most commonly cited trigger in adults. The association is strong enough that AIWS is sometimes classified as a migraine variant or aura phenomenon in the literature. A significant proportion of adults who report AIWS episodes experience them in connection with migraine onset.
What about children? Because from what I read, it is actually more common in children than adults.
Yes. In the pediatric population, infectious illness is the most commonly documented trigger. Specifically, Epstein-Barr virus, the virus responsible for infectious mononucleosis, has been reported as the triggering agent in a substantial number of pediatric AIWS cases. Other viral infections, including influenza, varicella, and certain enteroviruses, have also been documented as triggers.
Which is kind of wild when you think about it. You get a relatively common illness as a child, and your brain temporarily starts running a completely different program.
The human body continues to absolutely astound me.
Additional documented triggers include certain medications, particularly anticonvulsants and antimalarials in some reported cases. Psychological stress and sleep deprivation have been cited as possible contributing factors, though the evidence is less robust. There are also cases in the literature associated with structural brain lesions, including tumors, though these are less common and warrant separate clinical investigation.
I want to be clear about something here. If someone is experiencing these perceptual distortions and they do not have a history of migraines or a recent illness, they should talk to a doctor. Because while AIWS is typically benign, anything affecting perception in that way is worth having evaluated.
That is correct and appropriate guidance.
Great. Luma approved my medical advice. Adding that to my resume. One of the things that struck me most in the research is the question of prevalence, because the honest answer seems to be that we do not fully know, partly because the condition is underreported. Think about it from the perspective of a child who experiences it. You see your hands change size in the middle of the night. You feel the ceiling coming down. You do not necessarily have the vocabulary to describe what happened in a way that would lead a parent or a doctor to think, oh, that sounds like a documented neurological condition. More likely, it gets filed as a dream or an overactive imagination or anxiety.
Because that is exactly what happens. That is my literal experience. My mother was not negligent. She was a perfectly loving parent. She just did not have a framework for what I was describing, so she defaulted to the most reasonable explanation available to her. And I defaulted to believing her because she was my mother.
Right. And so you end up with this condition that is probably much more common than the formal literature suggests. because a large portion of the people who have experienced it never reported it to anyone who could have recorded it. The data that does exist suggests it is most prevalent in children between ages 5 and 10, with a gradual decline in frequency as people get older. Many people who experience it in childhood never experience it again as adults. Some do continue to have episodes, particularly if they are migraine sufferers.
I want to ask something that I think a lot of people are going to be wondering. Is there any version of this that is not benign? Should people be scared?
The vast majority of documented cases are benign. They are disorienting in the moment, sometimes frightening, but they pass and they do not cause lasting damage. The concern, and this is where Luma is going to come back in, is distinguishing AIWS from other conditions that can cause perceptual distortions, some of which do require intervention.
Correct. Perceptual distortions can also occur in the context of epileptic activity, certain psychiatric conditions, or medication effects. The clinical differentiation between AIWS and these other causes is important. If episodes are frequent, escalating, accompanied by other neurological symptoms, or occurring outside the context of migraine or known illness, neurological evaluation is warranted.
So the short version is, most of the time, if this happened to you once or a few times as a child during an illness or alongside a headache, you are almost certainly fine. If it is happening frequently and without explanation, go see a doctor. What about treatment? Can you actually treat this?
There is no specific treatment for Alice in Wonderland Syndrome as an isolated condition. Management is primarily directed at the underlying cause. For migraine-associated AIWS, standard migraine management strategies, including lifestyle modification, trigger avoidance, and pharmacological treatment of migraines, may reduce the frequency of AIWS episodes as well. In cases associated with viral illness, particularly Epstein-Barr virus, the episodes typically resolve as the illness resolves. No specific antiviral treatment has been demonstrated to target or eliminate AIWS independently.
So, essentially, the treatment is treat the thing causing it, and the AIWS often resolves on its own.
In most documented cases, yes, which is reassuring given the absence of a targeted pharmacological intervention. The prognosis in pediatric cases is generally favorable.
Can I say something that is slightly off script here?
You always do.
I think there is something genuinely meaningful about the fact that for a lot of people, the most important thing that could have happened is just someone telling them there was a name for it. Because the experience of having something strange happen to your body and your perception and not knowing what it was, that has its own weight. It does not go away when the episode does. You carry it as this unexplained thing, and then one day you find out it had a name the whole time, and a mechanism, and a history, and that changes something.
That is actually exactly why I wanted to make this video. I want to spend a few minutes on the open questions, because I think the things science has not figured out yet are at least as interesting as the things it has.
There are several significant unresolved questions in the AIWS literature. The first is the question of true prevalence. Because the condition is underreported, under-recognized, and has historically been misclassified, the actual frequency with which it occurs in the population is unknown. Studies vary widely in their estimates. The second open question concerns the precise neural substrate. While cortical spreading depression is the leading mechanistic explanation, the specific cortical regions and the exact pathways by which electrical disruption translates into each type of perceptual distortion are not fully mapped. The relationship between visual cortex disruption and body schema disruption, for example, involves pathways that are not entirely understood.
And The time distortion one. That one still feels underexplained to me.
Temporal perception remains one of the least well understood aspects of neurological function. The literature on AIWS-related time distortion is relatively sparse compared to the spatial and body distortion literature. It is an area that warrants further investigation.
There is also the question of why some people only experience it once and others experience it repeatedly throughout their lives. Why does one child have one episode at age 7 and never again? And another child has episodes throughout adolescence.
Genetic predisposition has been proposed as a factor. There are reported familial clusters of both AIWS and migraine, which is consistent with a genetic component. However, the specific genes involved, if any, have not been definitively identified.
So we have a condition that is real, documented, has a clear mechanism that is partially understood, and is probably more common than we know. And it has been going on in human brains for as long as human brains have existed. And Lewis Carroll possibly wrote one of the most beloved books in history because of it.
That is an accurate and concise summary.
Thank you, Luma. Here is what I keep coming back to. The brain is doing something extraordinary every single second. It is taking raw sensory data, which is just electrical signals, and it is constructing a coherent, stable, continuous experience of reality for you. And it is doing this so seamlessly, so completely, that most of us never even think about the fact that it is happening. Alice in Wonderland Syndrome is what happens when the machinery slips, just for a moment. And in that moment, you get a glimpse of what your brain is actually doing, which is building the world for you in real time. And sometimes it gets it wrong.
My ceiling was not falling. I know that now. But 9-year-old Milo felt it. He felt it completely. And the fact that it was not real does not erase the fact that it happened inside him, in his experience, as completely as anything else he has ever felt.
The subjective experience of reality is a construction. This is not a comforting or uncomfortable fact. It is simply a fact. What I find significant is that conditions like Alice in Wonderland Syndrome make visible something that is otherwise invisible. The enormous, continuous, effortful process by which the brain maintains the experience of a stable world. When that process fails, even briefly, we learn something about its architecture.
Soft, but sovereign. Even when your brain is lying to you, you are still here. You are still asking questions. You are still figuring it out. Thank you for watching. If this found you because you needed a name for something, I am glad it did. Subscribe if you want more of this, and I will see you in the next one.